So apologies for our slightly delayed start time. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Bannan Forum event, Disinformation and Discernment. My name is Aaron Willis. I'm the director of the Bannan Forum and the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. Excuse me. Apologies, I have allergies plus the smoke, so it's doubly bad. The Ignatian tradition is anchored in the ideal of individuals who are contemplatives in action. That means being a community of people who reflect critically on our context, experiences, motives, and ourselves before moving towards action, and then again after we have acted. Allowing space for deep, reflective thought is one of the most salient characteristics of the Jesuit worldview, and shaped what we do here at Santa Clara, root and branch. Yet this tradition of discernment depends not just on internal reflection, it also involves engaging with the world around us. Within our Jesuit tradition, contemplative individuals have always been fully part of the issues of the day, not passive sitters on the sideline. But what happens to even the strongest practices of discernment when the sources of information that give us our sense of our context, experience, and knowledge are intentionally filled with disinformation and misinformation? When it becomes increasingly difficult for us to engage with our fellow citizens and the world around us honestly and meaningfully, how can we make the good decisions based on the right motives? The Bannan Forum has as our current theme, tech and the human spirit. This involves a series of conversations on how we can engage with and shepherd technology in a way that leads to human flourishing in all its dimensions. I think few would argue that our current global political climate is one conducive to human flourishing. We have seen the ways in which the new media ecosystems created by digital platforms and social media companies have less often awash with competing narratives, siloed political and cultural communities, and vitriol fueled by questionable information. How can we as a Jesuit institution of higher education and a community of people living and working in Silicon Valley create technologies and practices which lead to better outcomes in our personal and communal decisions? Technological innovation will give us the results we ask and expect of it. Today's conversation is meant to help us think critically on this ever-changing digital culture, to understand how we can start to counter campaigns which are often meant to fuel a sense of desolation and fear within our communities and within ourselves. So I'm happy that our distinguished guest, Renee DiResta, agreed to speak to us about the realities of our current context, how various actors are using technology to generate particular experiences online, and some ways of addressing the issues as we move forward. And so if you're going to be contemplatives in action, I can think of few better in helping us to be fruitful in our contemplation of these serious and pressing issues than the two people who will be on our stage today. Father Paul Sukup will be Renee's conversation partner today and help moderate our discussion. And he teaches courses in technology and communication here at Santa Clara University and does research on religious communication. He has authored or edited a number of books and works with both the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the American Bible Society on communication issues. Father Sukup has explored the connections between communication and theology since 1982. His publications include Communication and Theology, Christian Communication, a Bibliographical Survey, Media, Culture, and Catholicism, Mass Media, the Moral Imagination, and Fidelity in Translation, Communicating the Bible in New Media. Most recently, he has published an edited collection of essays applying Walter Ong's thought of Ong and media ecology, essays in communication, composition, and literary studies. Our distinguished guest, Renee DiResta, is the Director of Research at New Knowledge and Head of Policy at nonprofit Data for Democracy. She investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks and assists policymakers in understanding and responding to the problem. She has advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations, and studied disinformation and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorism, and state-sponsored information warfare. Renee is a 2018 Mozilla Fellow in Media, Misinformation and Trust. She regularly writes and speaks about the role tech platforms and curatorial algorithms play in the proliferation of disinformation and conspiracy theories, and is an idea contributor at Wired. Her tech industry writing, analysis, talks, and data visualizations have been featured or covered by numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg, and many others. She was also recently named Vanity Fair's 2018 Future Innovators Index. So please join me in welcoming Renee to Santa Clara University.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, great. So sorry I was late. I got stuck. It took an hour to get here from Stanford. So I'm really sorry about that. I am honored to be here today. I really appreciated that framing, particularly the term discernment, which I think is something that I'm looking forward to a conversation that thinks about our role in the world and ways in which we are increasingly disinformed, and how that is impacting policies, how that's impacting elections, and how that's impacting actually the ways that we relate to each other as well. So I'm going to start by doing a quick, I guess, kind of taxonomy, sort of a series of taxonomies to describe a little bit of how we see the problem shaping up. So my kind of day job, I guess, is actually building technology that helps us to identify malign campaigns as early as possible. The idea being that detection and then detection is the best way to mitigate the effects, as opposed to trying to push out fact checks or correct the record after something has already gone viral. So we see the problem as sort of split into 4 distinct subproblems. There's misinformation. So that's when information that spreads on the internet is inadvertently wrong. You can think about that in the terms of maybe the hoax emails. I don't know how old everybody is, but the hoax emails you used to get forwarded along kind of back in the day. There is misinformation usually is an accident. Sometimes a newspaper will push out something that is incorrect, sort of in the heat of a breaking news situation, and then that will be picked up and people will run with it, and then the correction will not make it quite as far. Another example of misinformation would be some of the health content on the internet, myths that tend to persist, that vaccines cause autism, that chemotherapy is a vast government conspiracy to keep you sick. There's a lot of stuff out there that is put out with good intentions, but unfortunately is still wrong and still spreads quite far. Disinformation, the distinction there between the two is really intent. With disinformation, the person who's pushing out the narrative is doing it with the explicit purpose of misinforming people. So they know that the information is false when they create it, and they still push it out anyway with the intent of trying to deliberately seed a hoax. So with this type of thing, you could look at something like, an example would be a few of the trolling campaigns we've seen, where you will have a group of people who has a particular political alignment or a particular affinity, and they will go and they will create accounts masquerading as a different type of people. They will perhaps create petitions, they will create social groups, they will create Twitter accounts, they will do things to create distinct impressions about either a policy or a type of person or a particular type of group, and they will do this by masquerading as that group. One very notable example of this is Russia's interference in the American elections in 2016, where the Russian actors who were running that campaign were actually masquerading as Americans. So there was a level of disingenuousness, a level of inauthenticity that was quite deliberate, and that was necessary, in fact, to create the kind of influence that they were striving for. Propaganda. Propaganda is information with an agenda. So oftentimes it's actually true. A lot of it is true, and that's why it's so resonant. But it's presented in a particular way with particular types of language cues or visual cues that orient the perception of the information in a certain way. It's designed to convince you of something. And fake news, that's really, at this point, it means almost nothing. It means information I don't like on the internet. But for a brief moment in time, it referred to the phenomenon of organizations that purported to be news organizations, but were really kind of spam press that were creating clickbait, creating sensationalism, creating blatantly false, misleading headlines that had absolutely nothing to do with reality, usually with some sort of economic motivation. So that was kind of always the difference that we used. Disinformation was done deliberately by bad actors who were trying to influence people. Fake news, there was often kind of a strong economic underpinning. And that kind of brings us to the 5 entities that are currently doing these things. So we can call this the 5 types of bad actors. We've got state actors right up at the top, and that's because increasingly the information ecosystem is being co-opted by groups with an agenda. It's sort of the war of all against all. It's the idea that anybody can run these playbooks and everybody is. And so the kind of activity that we see from state actors, Russia is my kind of go-to example there, but I actually could have probably put up Iran or Saudi Arabia as well. We do see foreign actors trying to influence Americans, and specifically trying to influence American politics by masquerading as Americans. But the same playbook that they run was actually run back in 2015 by ISIS and by other terrorist organizations that we see. In 2014, we saw it being run by conspiracy theorists and true believers. In 2016, again, domestic ideologues. I picked Pepe the Frog because that was the most visible kind of incarnation of it, but it happens on both sides of the political aisle. And then spammers who, as I said, are doing it for economic motivation. And to kind of give a walk through the playbook, what they're basically doing is they're coordinating an influence operation in one part of the internet. So usually where we see that happening is on a message board, for example, or a special chat channel or a private group. And so you'll have these groups of people that kind of come together and discuss what they're going to do in one place. And then they go and they create their content. And when they're creating their content, they're putting the memes and the videos up on the internet, usually on platforms that have some lift of their own, so something like YouTube or Imgur. Imgur is for meme content, it's for visuals, and YouTube is for videos. And so they will plan their operation, they will create their content, and then they will push the content out. They have to make the content reach the mainstream. And so the way that they do this is by putting it up on Facebook, putting it up on Instagram is a very popular platform for misinformation now, Tumblr, yeah, I think those would be probably, and Twitter. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram are probably the big 3 for dissemination. And what we see there is, again, this very coordinated kind of pipeline process that all of these types of actors go through virtually identically. The goal being to blanket the entire information ecosystem with the content they create, with the narratives that they're spreading, so that people who are targeted by this type of information receive it in a barrage. If you see it once, it's not going to resonate. If you see it 5,000 times from 200 different accounts, then it's going to stick, or at least you're going to start to think that this is real, that this is widespread, and that a lot of people hold this opinion. So the goal for all 5 of these is really to just get their content into your feed. And they're going to do that by manipulating whatever algorithms they can. They're going to do it by using bots to create the perception that it's an extremely large percentage of the population that believes a certain thing. And they're going to piggyback on the algorithms that social platforms use to identify what to show you. So when we're evaluating the kind of content that we see on the internet, when we're evaluating whether something is misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, what we always look to is we try to gauge the content. So what is the narrative that someone is trying to put out there? We try to gauge the voice. Who of those 5 actors is behind it, or is it actually real, organic content by someone from a member of the community? And then the last piece is the dissemination. When things are moving through that content pipeline, when things are moving through that process, are they moving through in a way that is indicative of an organic process, meaning I share something and some percentage of my friends pick it up and share it, and some percentage of their friends maybe pick it up and share it, but it's not a simultaneous explosion of my content all over the internet simultaneously at precisely the same moment, which is what we see a lot of these actors doing when they want to get content trending. Does this all make sense so far? Okay. So the net effect of this sorts of types of disinformation crossed against the matrix of the actors that try to put it out, crossed against the different platforms that they have to put it out on, means that you have this kind of phenomenally complex information ecosystem where you are increasingly prone to seeing the things that either that the platforms are going to show you, but the things that the platforms show you are manipulated by the people who are trying to game the algorithm that the platform is using to decide what you see. The net effect of this is this democratization of propaganda, where any of those 5 groups can take this type of content and can push it out to people. The effect of that is that we have eliminated the editorial gatekeepers. We have eliminated the idea of oversight. So we have created an environment where anyone who is so inclined can create vast quantities of propaganda and can get it into the feeds of the people who are most likely to be receptive to it. There's kind of I would say 3 things that came together over the last 10 years on the internet that really made this happen. There's a consolidation of mass numbers of people onto maybe 5 platforms. So Facebook has 2 billion users, Twitter has about 300 million. I think Instagram last count was somewhere between 5 and 800 million. So there was a mass consolidation of people onto a very small handful of platforms. That means that when this democratization of propaganda, this has happened, there's this proliferation of content. The mechanism by which you have to reach the number of channels on which you have to reach someone is actually quite small. So you have this proliferation of nonsense and a very narrow target pathway to send it down to ensure that you're going to reach massive quantities of people. So when we talk about the weaponization of narratives, what we're really talking about is the way in which the information ecosystem has lent itself to the creation of this type of content, and the algorithms reinforce the content because there is no sophistication. The tech platform algorithms do not understand what they are showing you. They only know that their job is to show you something that you want to see that's going to keep you engaged on the platform. And that's where we get into the challenge of the business model. So when you have a business model that the tech platforms all have a business model of targeted advertising. So when you are on the platform, their job is to keep you on the platform so that you continue to see what is likely to engage you. They want you to click, they want you to like, they want you to share. And that's because when you take these actions, when you engage with the content that they show you, you're teaching the algorithm that you want to see more of it. And you are also, you're telling the platform something about yourself, something that they can use to target you with advertising. So when they make their money by connecting advertisers to the people who are most likely to be receptive to their products. And so what we see there is it's not just advertisers who are able to use that precision targeting, it's also the propagandists. So the narratives are weaponized not just in terms of the content being the most, being most likely to resonate with you, but also the precision with which you can find the people who are most likely to be receptive to the message. And I know that that's sort of a ton of different facets to the problem. It's actually quite complex. I hope we can really dig into that because I imagine there's a lot of questions there. But the takeaway is we have an information ecosystem where the power to influence opinions lies with those who most widely and effectively disseminate the message. So this is an ecosystem that was built for targeted advertising. That's its purpose. And yet right now we operate in a world in which our political conversations and our social conversations happen on that same infrastructure. So the way to be persuasive is to game the algorithm the best. The way to be persuasive is to precisely target your content so that it reaches the right small collection of people who are likely to be receptive to it in hopes that they in turn will begin to share it out on your behalf. So we've kind of inadvertently found ourselves in the creation of a dual-use technology here where the platforms that we think we're engaging with each other on have also proven to be remarkably attractive to influence operations, to foreign intelligence services, to terrorists, to spammers, and to other types of bad actors that want to reach you as well, not to sell you a t-shirt, but to sell you on an idea, to sell you on a political candidate, to sell you on a concept or a vision for the world that they have decided that you are likely to be slightly interested in, and they will just kind of push you down the path. So I don't know if you want to have me go over a particular facet of this, or? Sure.
Renee, thank you again for the introduction to this. I think it's helpful to get that kind of context. I was delighted to hear you talk about the information ecosystem. One of the areas of research that I do is in what we call media ecology, where we recognize that all of our communication forms a very complex system. And what is difficult for us is when that system changes, because we've been accustomed to doing things in a particular way. And now, as you pointed out, we introduce social media, we introduce algorithms of which we are not conscious, and the tools that we had no longer work. And I think if we dig into that a little bit, we can try and probe what changed. In the 1970s, there was a whole string of communication research called the agenda setting theory. And it was looking at the role of the press, and they said, the press doesn't tell us what to think, but it tells us what to think about by setting contexts. From what you're saying, it seems like many of these narratives do tell us what to think. Is that an accurate?
I think that's true. I think the information ecosystem doesn't lend itself to long-form deep thought. And what I mean by that is the way that there's it's kind of a cycle. The feed reinforces what it thinks people are clicking on. It doesn't think it knows, actually. It knows down to the, to the minute detail, yes. So for a while, there was a big push on Facebook to get people to create more video content. And that's because when video was relatively new on Facebook, a ton of people were engaging with the video content. And so there were a lot of newsrooms that actually kind of ran out and decided they were going to build up that capability because Facebook was saying we're going to privilege video. For a while, live was another thing that was, the idea that you would have these streaming services. You would go live on Facebook. There was a version called Periscope. There were a couple of, Meerkat, I think, was another one. A number of these apps that came out to facilitate that real-time connection. Then there were a few high-profile, I think there was a suicide. I think there was a few murders. I think the platforms kind of stepped back and said, we have no control over this. A lot of times with news media on TV, there's still a tape delay. There's still a little tiny, minute filter there. So the idea that they had entirely removed just that one tiny delay, the kind of resulting effects, the unintended consequences of that made them really take a step back from that. But as they made that switch to video, as they began to prioritize video in the news feed and surface video content, the publishers who had decided to go hard on video because they saw this as, Facebook was telling them this is the new wave, now find themselves where the video content has been deprecated again. It's not bumped to the top of the feed. So in many ways, the information providers, or the historical information providers, journalists and others, change the format of the content they produce to meet the new distributors, to kind of to operate under the rules of the new distributors. And that's because most people now, I think it's 60%, get their news from Facebook, and so so the publishers increasingly feel compelled to operate according to the rules of the platforms that have the most users on them.
We think about what else may have changed in this. We've always known about the economic background for any kind of news, although we've largely been unconscious of it, and I think even more so now. And you were pointing that out, how all of this really is a business model which has been co-opted by something else. Is there anything else in the business model? Is it simply maximizing dollars, or is there something else that's going on in that model?
No, for up until I would say maybe the last 6 months, it's really just been maximize engagement. Now we're starting to see some of the device manufacturers actually kind of come in and weigh in. I don't know how many of you have the latest iPhone, the latest iOS update. I get my push notification on Sunday that tells me if I've used my phone more or less. My number is embarrassingly high. I live on that phone. But it's to try to make you realize actually how high it really is. And so now iOS has this guardrail where you can I don't know how many people have seen this report. I encourage you to opt in. It's very interesting, just from like taking personal inventory. It says you can click in and it'll show you how much time you spent on a given app, and you can actually set a limit for yourself. So you can say in a given, I don't remember if it's day or week, because I'll be honest, I haven't set any for myself yet. But you can set it's kind of got like it actually grays out the app, and you can't go into it if you've set a limit for yourself of 6 hours of Facebook a week or something like that. You can't go back in. So it's trying to break that. I feel like addiction is not quite the right word. I know that some people use it. I think that the jury is kind of still out on if it really is the same mechanism as an actual addiction. But that idea that when your phone sends you a push notification, you stop and pick it up. Like these are attention brokers. You are always, they're always vying for your attention. Every app on your phone at this point, except for the ones you've paid for, is vying for your attention. And that's why you have this barrage of notifications coming through at all times. It just changes the way that people are less deliberate. There's less, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't take out their phone with intention. It's more reactive. And so the device manufacturers are trying to step in and say, maybe we can bring some intention back into this process, make people a little bit more aware of what they're doing.
And I look again at that ecosystem, what's changed, one thing that strikes me is the scale. And not just what you're talking about. I do remember one study that just indicated how many times a day people pull out their phones. And it is remarkable. I can't think off the top of my head what it is, because I'm old enough to say, well, I'll still use a phone to make a phone call.
Oh, I think it tells you, by the way, in the new device thing, it'll tell you. I think mine was like 80 or something. It's really just, especially if you work, if you, I have a remote team, so I'm in Slack a lot of the time, I'm in email all the time, phone, and it just breaks it down for you, but it tells me how many times a day I pick up my phone, and it's like, I think it's literally 80. I'm not making that up yet.
No, but I think that scale has to do with this problem of why these sites are so influential for us, because we are simply flooded with that information. And as you said, you create a narrative by the frequency with which people see it.
Yes, and the experience, for the most part, is good. They are not, the micro attention to maximizing attention means that they are working very hard to produce a product that people want to use. And so that's where I think the challenge for users is, maybe thinking about it more in almost like a junk food model, right? I really like donuts, but that doesn't mean that I should be eating donuts 80 times a day. And so that's the idea of, the concept of the nudge, I think, is an interesting one. Which direction do you push people in? Right now, all of these apps, they don't compete on features, but because they're competing for your time, they're sort of competing to build in these, let's use the word addiction for the time being, these addiction loops. YouTube will autoplay the video for you. Facebook has a never-ending feed. Twitter will do the same thing. There's 5 different things that kind of capture your attention when you open it up. Do you want to see moments? Do you want to see what it's just, what your friends are talking about? So really the goal is to keep you feeling good and feeling engaged. You're very rarely going to encounter content that you don't want to see. And that's where we get at the sort of historical framing of the problem, which is in terms of things like filter bubbles. The idea that the platform is, if you are a Democrat, it is not going to show you Republican content because that will make you angry and you will not engage. Maybe you'll type a nasty comment, but you're not going to keep coming back to the platform. Whereas if they show you something that makes you feel that makes you feel like you want to engage with the content. Maybe it makes you happy, pictures of your kids, pictures of your family, or alternately, it makes you feel angry in a constructive way. This is something that they're actually quite good at, which is understanding the idea of righteous indignation. You're shown something by a source that you trust that frames an issue in a certain way, and you are so compelled to share because you believe that by sharing you are educating your community, you are helping your friends be more informed. It's not just designed to make you angry, it's designed to make you want to take an action. Because when it hits you with something that does make you take an action, it learns something about you, learns something about what to show you for the next time. And that's how the ecosystem works.
I want to follow up on that sense of nudge, because it's moving us closer to this idea of kind of discernment and the human spirit.
Yep.
I mean, nudge works because it's something I'm already leaning towards.
Yep.
And it gets me to that point. And so let's look at us as human beings. How have we changed in this particular kind of technological world? It's been a very rapid change, 10 years or so since we've had a smartphone and carry these things around with us. But the nudge isn't going to work unless there's already something in me that leans that way. So I'm curious, what does this do to us as human beings? How does this information ecosystem change us?
I think there's a gentleman by the name of Tristan Harris who does a lot of interesting research on this. They look at, so he and folks he runs a center called Center for Humane Technology, which is the idea that we could be asking the platforms to do more, to actually place more human values into the products. The idea that I don't want, I as a mom don't want to give my child YouTube because I know that I'm going to have to kind of tear it away from him. And because that sort of never-ending stream of videos, he doesn't have an intuitive sense that it is supposed to end, that TV time is done. So there's a challenge there when we think about ways in which our information consumption has changed. I feel like in maybe 15 years ago, when people still got their news from newspaper, you would watch an hour of it on the TV in the evening, or maybe you would get the paper delivered and you would read it with your coffee in the morning. So you were plugged into the events of the world, but you weren't plugged in to every micro event that happened as it was developing. And that's a really different shift for people. Instead of reading the digested, processed, evaluated, fact-checked, curated, candidly, kind of view of the world as these are the top 10 things you should be paying attention to. Instead, there's this barrage of information. So we talk about it as the shift from information scarcity historically to information glut now, which is you actually can't exist on the internet without curatorial functions. The platforms curate because there's so much content that it is impossible for you to get through in a day. So yes, you have this interminable feed, but if you follow 1,000 people on Twitter, even if you follow, candidly, 100 people on Twitter, the idea that you are going to read it to the end every day, that's just not going to happen. If you have a couple hundred friends on Facebook, especially if you've been on Facebook for a period of years and you've got your work friends, your school friends, your family friends, you're never going to see all of that content. So the curation functions, which unfortunately are very easily manipulated by bad actors, are what shapes what we see. And they are personalized. So we live in an environment where there's this mass proliferation of information. Curation is not being done by anyone with any kind of editorial oversight. It's being done by algorithm. And the algorithms don't necessarily have a sense of, they have a hard time ranking what is societally important. They can maybe understand what is important at a given moment for an individual, but it just means that we're not really operating in the realm of the same conversations. What I see is very different from what you see, which is very different from what you see. That makes it personally appealing, but it concerns me that we wind up in these echo chambers where there's actually not really a very shared basis in conversation. The concept of what is important, you can think actually quite recently the migrant caravan story that was all over the press. It was really in the conservative press way earlier than it was in the liberal press, and it kind of had to make that leap. So there are conversations that are happening about certain topics that actually don't cross the chasm until they reach a certain kind of critical mass in a social community, and then they kind of make the leap to mainstream news. This is how conspiracy theories operate as well. They start in very small pockets, and then oftentimes they will kind of reach the mainstream by way of activity on social media, inspiring a reporter to write about that activity, which then puts that activity onto the evening news or into a major publication. So everyone isn't getting the same stories at the same time. Some people would argue that this is actually a good thing. The personalization is a great thing. But I think that it does lead to a challenge of when we engage as a society, we are not really engaging with the same facts. We are not engaging with the same topics. We hear things very differently, and we see things very differently, and it's very much an isolating, like a personalized experience.
So the question becomes, how do we join together again under some kind of commonality? We used the word, even Aaron, at the very beginning about the sense of discernment, and it's part of this. It's a religious tradition, yeah. But it's usually rooted in a shared understanding, a shared world. Right. And now we're at a world where we don't have that. So what do we do to come back to it? Because if we simply get our curated information in our little world, we've never made the jump to the other.
Right. That's the question.
If you can solve that.
Yeah,
then.
I know. I wish I had a 2-minute soundbite for you on that. I don't. That's actually the really difficult question, which is, first, there's the question of who is responsible for that, right? And there are very different answers to that question. I imagine even in this room, you'd have some very, very different opinions on that. Some people feel that it is not the platform's job to function as that curator, actually, and that they call it like the nostalgia for Dan Rather is misguided because we had very siloed media ecosystems where only sort of 1 or 2 points of view were represented. Maybe they were liberal and conservative, but you didn't hear from the kind of micro groups XYZ and their particular take on it. So there wasn't this like diversity of opinion that we have today in social media, where there are no editorial gatekeepers. Anyone can write what they want. This leads to sometimes really fantastic, the proliferation of like young people on YouTube who are creators, who actually, there's a lot of really fantastic stuff on there. There are entire new genres of, YouTube unboxing videos, ASMR, there's so many little subcultures on YouTube it's just a fascinating place. You don't get that on mainstream TV, right? And so there is this value there, and so we don't want to like throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the problem is really the only people who can be responsible for the social platforms right now are the social platforms. And when the business ecosystem, when their business model has incentivized this ecosystem to develop in the way that it has, it's very hard to get them to act against their interests, to limit them, to limit your time, to change what you see in your feed, to think about maybe harm reduction as a principle. And this is in part because the idea of that, when certain groups find themselves downranked or deprecated, that's where you get into these media firestorms about I've been censored. When Twitter does kind of mass culling of accounts, which they periodically do, they take a lot of accounts down simultaneously for violating the provisions around authenticity. In the last 2, I believe, conservative accounts were disproportionately impacted. Well, disproportionately is sort of a funny way to say it, because that implies that there is an idea that this should be done like equally, like account by account, which is not actually true. It was just that more conservative accounts, more high-profile conservative accounts lost more followers because they happened to be followed by more of what Twitter deemed to be inauthentic accounts. So unfortunately, that left the narrative that right-wing accounts were being disproportionately censored and Twitter was taking away their followers. There was no evidence whatsoever to indicate that Twitter looked at content or content of tweets to make that determination. They look at behaviors, not at the actual content. But that still is a very unsatisfying thing for people who have decided that they were disproportionately harmed by this attempt that the platforms have made to kind of prune the garden, restore order to the ecosystem. And that's where we are today. So anytime the platforms do something, you see this in the halls of Congress. You have these hearings where the heads of tech companies are hauled up not to talk about real material important problems, but because some politician feels put upon because like their tweet didn't go as viral as they thought it should have. And so it's this sort of the conversation around who should be responsible is a very hard one right now. It's extremely polarized.
It also, I think, suggests a certain need for self-knowledge. I mean, I need to know how I'm reacting, how I'm nudged. I know that people here probably have some questions, and I'm keeping one eye on the time. So I think, Aaron, are you going to bring a microphone around for? Okay.
Yeah, I think the idea of people being responsible and people having agency, this is something that we keep coming back to. Mm-hmm. I think that's dependent upon people having a better understanding of what's happening, and an increase in transparency on the part of the companies. Those are sort of the two preconditions for people really being able to have a better idea of what's going on, particularly when it comes to disinformation, because it is so effective and it is so targeted. Most people are not on Facebook thinking this meme that I'm seeing is being shared by a Russian troll. That's just not the mindset that people operate in. And frankly, that's where I feel that it is the platform's job to manage that type of activity, because you don't want people living in a state of constant suspicion. And that's where we're headed right now.
And I want to invite any questions if we have things. Yes.
I'm Jonathan. I attend the university here. One of the questions I had was the effect of political micro-targeting that came up 2008. I know the Obama campaign used it. Campaigns since then have used it. I was wondering what effect that is having on disinformation, whether these groups are engaging in political micro-targeting.
Yes, they are. They are. There's the House of Representatives released a data set of the 3,000 or so ads that the Russian accounts ran. It's probably the best example of this. I would definitely, if you're interested, go look at it. It's just on house.gov, so the House Intelligence Committee. What they found was the trolls used geographic targeting. So geographic targeting is they can, literally it's like people who lived in this state. What they did was they found cities where there had been officer-involved shootings, and they targeted the black communities in those cities with ads and encouraging them to come out for protests and things like that. And with sort of also with voter suppression ads as well. They did, so besides the geographic targeting, which was very closely tied to news events, they also did demographic targeting. Coal miners, they had a page that ran a coal miners for Trump rally that targeted people who worked as coal miners. They targeted young people, so 15 to 18, with meme pages and with music plugins, which had malware. They targeted older people with anti-immigration rhetoric, feeling that performed best among particularly older white men. So there was gender, there was race, there was interest-based targeting. So interest-based targeting is, I'm a mom, and so anyone who wants to reach me with mom products can find women between the ages of 22 and 44 who are interested in parenting. So we see that same, again, these are platforms built for advertising. And as far as, they can be used to advertise baby shoes or an idea, right? Or a political protest or propaganda telling black people not to vote. And so that's where the dual use of the system really comes into play. Facebook's had a number of extremely unfortunate, high-profile failures. Thank you, that have been brought to light over the last 2 years regarding the deeply problematic notion of micro-targeting. You can target by zip code if you are in an extremely rural area where only 6 people live in your zip code. You can reach people pretty directly. I think there's going to be a fair amount more, both in the US and the UK, in terms of investigative work that's been done to understand the specific frameworks by which Russian and Iranian and other trolls and political campaigns like Cambridge Analytica use those tools.
Yes. Aaron, right in front of you.
Hi, I'm David Sloss. I'm a law professor here at Santa Clara. So I'm wondering about, I mean, we're talking mostly about what's going on here in the US, but there's also been some very disturbing things about Facebook being used to sort of basically incite, genocide or mass violence in other countries, which, as I understand it, one of the problems with that is, I think the U.S. government is sort of powerful enough to regulate Facebook to the extent that it wants to, right? But there's a lot of other countries out there who actually don't have the ability to do that because basically these big social media companies are more powerful than some smaller governments, right? Do you have any thoughts about what can be done about that? Because I think this is a serious problem that these platforms are being used to incite violence.
Well, in that particular case, Myanmar, I believe the latest story on that about 3 weeks ago was that it was military intelligence that was using the platforms to incite violence. So sometimes there are instances of governments actively carrying out these atrocities themselves. So they are completely disincentivized from asking for regulation in any way. We saw this with, there's a couple articles that are really fantastic if you want to see from the electoral standpoint how Duterte got elected and the trolling campaigns that he ran they absolutely own it. So there's a lot of instances, and this is really the challenge, which is who is responsible for regulating them. We see, roughly speaking, when we talk about just disinformation, not all of the addiction and polarization, just talking about disinformation, there is sort of three factors. There is mass consolidation of audiences, so millions of people on 5 platforms. There is precision targeting, the ability to reach the person, to reach someone with exactly the right message for them. And then there is gameable algorithms. And these are the 3 things that kind of come together. When we talk about the targeting, Europe has been the one that's really kind of led the way on that with the GDPR, which is a privacy general, I'm sorry, I totally forgot what the acronym stands for off the top of my head. It's Europe's general data privacy regulation. It's a extremely complex series of requirements that European governments have put in place for their citizens and how their data should be handled on social platforms, including things like a right to be forgotten, disclosure requirements. You have to opt in to various types of tracking. You have to opt into various types of data gathering. The idea being that people should have a much more informed consent approach to understanding what they're using and what they're doing. On the mass consolidation of audiences, that's where the U.S. is starting to talk about antitrust. I don't know if that will really go anywhere, but that's the thing that keeps getting offered up, the idea that if you break up the platforms, you don't have everyone on 5 of them, and also you potentially can have the creation of new platforms because there's an opportunity for more competition. So you could even have new platforms that don't use the advertising business model that everyone picked up 10 years ago. The challenge really does come down to who regulates. I think a lot of it is right now, it's still in kind of the self-regulatory, is there enough bad press to lead them to do something about it? And that's not a very satisfactory feeling for most people.
It's from the back.
Hi, thank you. How are you seeing, in what way could you anticipate sort of a mass education for people regarding
I'd actually love to hear your
dangers?
thoughts on this, Father, from the standpoint of, I grew up I was born in 81, so I had the internet by middle school. I learned to code when I was like 9, my dad's an engineer. I remember being in college and being in high school and middle school, frankly, and being told like the internet is not a source. That website is not a source. Funny enough, Wikipedia is not a source was like a huge one. I don't know what people are told about Wikipedia now, actually, because now Wikipedia is the source for the other platforms because it's sort of the best unadulterated like single source of truth. The idea being that the Wikipedia community is large enough at this point and global enough that that they have a mechanism for trying to help information get to the top and dealing with trolls and these sorts of things. I would love to hear actual educators talk about this. I think the challenge, as we see it, is that it's actually older people who are disproportionately more likely, time and time again in every study we've seen, to just kind of click the share button. And that's one of the challenges. So when we talk about media literacy, a big part of the problem is you don't want to tell people like question everything, because then that's also that's what every conspiratorial community on the internet will tell you: question everything. It's not necessarily the best advice. So it's really in a classroom setting, from K through college, you have access to people. You can help them develop these good habits. But I don't know what you do when people are no longer in that space.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's growing up in that ecosystem, so you're comfortable with what to do. Clearly, there has been a very long tradition of media education, starting back in the 1960s, and it was how to watch television, or how to kind of be aware of the kinds of messages that were coming in a mass society. But again, older people might get that, but not realize what's going on with the internet. And a lot of the sort of taken for granted ways, that good information will drive out bad information as a kind of received principle doesn't work anymore. And so you're right, we need to work with the students on it, but I don't think anyone's thought about how to work with an older group, an older adult group. So it's a good question, and maybe we would bring that into our Osher lifelong learning as a way of dealing with that.
So I have a question. Had a little experience working with the Orange County Register and the news. They were the largest newsprint for a time. And they were struggling with the reinvention of the newsroom. This was 20 years ago, as all the newspapers were. They were starting to feel the internet. You passed by very quickly the editor function, and the editor lives in an ecosystem. Above the editor, or actually a team of editors, is a publisher who has the business interests, yes, but also the communal interests. And so the fourth estate, both as a civic perspective of the ecosystem, not an economic, and then the advertising comes in. So every day, the editors were presented with a budget, and the budget was what space was there in the print available as a result of the advertising that had already been sold. And the publisher was always there to mediate the business interests, advertising, and the fourth estate responsibility for the community. So it seems like these platforms, as you said, are a business model. They're not replicating the editor ecosystem, much less the editor function, because the internet is a distribution technology. So I would love to hear any awareness you have of any studies on behalf of both the democratic community and society, not a democratic economy, that is being done by anyone to rethink this editorless world that we live in.
It's a constant topic of conversation. I tend to focus on distribution patterns because my personal work focuses so much more on disinformation. But to answer your question, there are Knight Foundation and Poynter, Poynter, both do a lot of studies of that facet. What are people seeing? What does curation look like? There are groups that are working, funded by Knight Foundation, that are working on things like fact-checking. Can we bring that function to the social platforms? One of the really big challenges, honestly, is the incessant allegations of bias. That anytime the reason that there is no longer a trending function on Facebook, I don't know how many people know this story. Facebook used to have this little thing on the right-hand side of the page called trending. It would just show you what news was trending on the platform. And they killed it a couple months back, and they killed it because they can't control it. And the reason that happened is the trending function used to have a small team of human editors. And the team of human editors, it was their job just to make sure that nothing really crazy got into there. Because trending, the cues that are surfaced are how many times people are sharing an article. So you can imagine, aliens landing and like so-and-so getting owned by somebody on social media, or like Hillary Clinton is really dead and there's a body double, and like all these insane conspiracy theories. That kind of stuff would get a ton of traction. People would share it, it would go viral, and then this is the stuff that was feeding into the trending pipeline. So there used to be human editorial curation, and the job of those people was to sit there and to not let that kind of like nuttery make it into what was called trending news. And there was I think an individual who left, claimed to be a whistleblower, and said that Facebook was deliberately censoring conservative press, and that Facebook editors were disproportionately removing conservative news sites from being featured in that trending module there. This created a huge firestorm. Like Glenn Beck and a couple of other conservative leaders, this was back in 2016, this was early 2016, I think, if I recall correctly, kind of like went to Facebook for a personal meeting with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and leaders of the product to talk about how Facebook was unfairly censoring their views. They came away feeling that Facebook was not, in fact, censoring their views, that there was no way that this could have happened, and that this whole story was fake news. But the Facebook, in an abundance of caution, not wanting to be seen as being unfairly censorious to a particular political party, removed the human editors from the function. And literally the next day, Megyn Kelly gets fired from Fox News for some fake offense, was the top trending story in that module on Facebook. And then this, all of a sudden it became like InfoWars, Zero Hedge, just, I got one day like a witch blog. It was literally like modern witches and modernwitch.com's take on like, I, by the way, don't follow anything remotely having to do with witches, so I couldn't figure out why the hell this was in my feed. But there it was. My job is to click around weird things on Facebook, so I get a disproportionate amount of weird things, and this was one of them. But I literally screenshotted it and sent it to a friend who worked on the product, and I was like, right now my trending feed is InfoWars, Zero Hedge, and a witch blog. I don't know what you guys just did, but you broke it. So and you get the message back, oh yeah, we're gonna go look into that, but that's because it is, this is how it's done, really. It's when you just leave it open to the algorithm and they decide that they're gonna tweak it, and like maybe we'll go back to interest-based trending, maybe we'll go back to local news-based trending. Local news for me surfaced some random teeny tiny blogs up in like Portland. And I live in San Francisco, and I'm like, I would think I would have gotten like the Chronicle or something, but no, I'm getting these weird things up in Portland. And this is all, they'll tell you like it's just one person's anecdotes, but that's the experience for everybody. Everybody has their like one person anecdotes. You really don't know what anybody else is seeing. They really can't control what's trending, and so they eventually just killed the feature. And this is, I hope, kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, but saying like, nobody has any good answers for this stuff yet. Facebook's response was literally to kill it, and Twitter's is to start this like national conversation with some academic researchers about what constitutes healthy conversation on the internet. It's algorithmic curation is just not very well done right now.
I'm keeping one eye on the clock, and we're going to be chronically terminated.
That's okay.
I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon. I think we've got lots to think about, and even some homework assignments for the university, to think about that whole media education thing. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Father, that's not working, sorry. I want to thank Father Paul as well for being here and facilitating the conversation. And I hope you all join us at our next event, which will be on January 24th, with historian Michael Best thinking about technology, wisdom, and human flourishing. So we'll see you all then, and have a great evening. Thank you.